Imagine a world where everyone is connected, everyone is talking, everyone has a voice, and yet we feel more divided, more anxious, and more hostile than ever before. We were promised that more communication would bring more understanding. But what if the opposite is happening? What if the very technologies designed to connect us are quietly pulling us apart? In Superbloom, Carr argues that we are living through a communication explosion so intense that it's overwhelming our social fabric. This is not a story about phones or apps alone. It's a story about human nature, power, and what happens when communication grows faster than our ability to handle it. Poppies. In early 2019, Walker Canyon in Southern California became the site of a rare natural event. After heavy winter rains, dormant poppy seeds burst into life, carpeting the hillsides in brilliant orange. The phenomenon was called a superbloom. Images spread rapidly on social media, drawing influencers and tourists from all over. At first, the mood was joyful. Photos were shared, likes poured in, and the bloom became an online sensation. But the celebration quickly turned destructive. Crowds trampled the flowers, pulled them from the ground for photos, clogged roads, and overwhelmed local authorities. What had been a fragile ecological miracle was damaged by the very attention meant to admire it. Online, admiration flipped into outrage. Praise became condemnation. Joy became shaming. Carr presents this episode as a metaphor for modern communication. Just like the poppies, messages today bloom everywhere, bright, abundant, and intoxicating. Our phones turn us into constant transmitters and receivers of information. We believed that more connection would lead to empathy and understanding. Instead, we find ourselves overwhelmed, polarized, and increasingly hostile. The super bloom of communication is beautiful, but it is also invasive and destabilizing. Part 1. Collapse. Chapter 1. A more perfect liquefaction. Carr opens the book's main argument by introducing an unexpected thinker, Charles Horton Cooley, a quiet, withdrawn sociologist who lived at the turn of the 20th century. Cooley was not a man of crowds or public debate. He was physically frail, socially anxious, and deeply introspective, often preferring solitude to human interaction. It was precisely this distance from everyday social bustle that allowed him to see something others missed. Cooley believed that society does not simply consist of individuals acting independently. Instead, individuals and society are formed together, simultaneously, through communication. Cooley rejected the popular idea that society is built from isolated selves pursuing personal interests. He argued that the self itself is shaped by social interaction. Our sense of who we are emerges from how others respond to us. Because of this, communication is not just a tool people use. It is the mechanism through which society operates. When communication changes, society changes with it. Carr emphasizes that Cooley was among the first to recognize that the speed and structure of communication matter more than the content being transmitted. As communication technologies become faster and more efficient, social relationships become more fluid. Long-standing institutions, traditions, and hierarchies lose their solidity. Cooley described this process as the liquefaction of society. What was once stable begins to melt and reshape itself continuously. Carr traces this liquefaction across history. Early humans could only communicate face-to-face, limiting influence to small groups. Writing freed communication from the body, allowing ideas to travel across time and space. Printing expanded this power further, weakening centralized authority while strengthening individual identity. Each technological leap reshaped how influence spread and how people associated with one another. However, Carr argues that Cooley made a critical mistake. He assumed that increased communication would naturally lead to greater understanding, rationality, and social harmony. Cooley underestimated darker aspects of human nature: tribalism, emotional reactivity, and the desire for dominance. As communication becomes more efficient, it does not merely liberate society, it destabilizes it. Liquefaction can dissolve shared norms just as easily as it dissolves unjust hierarchies. The chapter ends by setting up the book's central tension. Communication is powerful, transformative, and essential, but when it accelerates beyond human limits, it can fracture the very society it was meant to improve. Chapter 2. Privacy and the Public Interest. Carr begins this chapter with a moment that now feels almost quaint. A legal battle over a radio broadcast of comedian George Carlin's infamous routine listing 7 forbidden words. The case forced American courts to confront a fundamental question. Should all forms of communication be treated the same? For much of modern history, societies carefully distinguished between private communication and public broadcasting. Letters, phone calls, and personal messages were considered inviolable. Broadcasting, by contrast, carried special responsibilities because of its reach and influence. A radio station could reach millions of people at once, including children, without their consent. Because of this, broadcasters were expected to serve the public interest. Carr traces the deep historical roots of privacy, from sealed letters in ancient times to constitutional protections in the United States. People consistently believed that personal communication deserved confidentiality. Even when new technologies like the telegraph and telephone emerged, the public expected the same privacy standards to apply. Governments eventually enshrined these expectations into law, recognizing that trust in communication systems was essential for social stability. The Internet, Carr argues, collapses these carefully maintained distinctions. Social media platforms blend private conversation, public performance, and mass broadcasting into a single space. A message meant for friends can instantly become global content. At the same time, platforms monitor, store, and monetize communication, eroding privacy while avoiding the responsibilities traditionally imposed on broadcasters. This collapse creates confusion and conflict. Individuals lose control over their words, while companies gain unprecedented power over public discourse. Carr suggests that the breakdown of the boundary between private and public communication is one of the core reasons modern societies struggle to govern digital platforms effectively. Chapter 3. The Feed. In this chapter, Carr focuses on the defining structure of modern digital life, the feed. Unlike newspapers, books, or television programs, the feed has no natural ending. It refreshes endlessly, pulling users into a continuous stream of information. Carr explains that the feed is not neutral. Algorithms determine what appears and in what order, optimizing for engagement rather than understanding. Content that provokes strong emotional reactions, anger, fear, outrage, validation, rises to the top. Nuanced or complex ideas are buried. The feed collapses context. News, personal updates, advertisements, and political propaganda appear side by side, stripped of hierarchy or proportionality. Everything competes for attention on equal footing. This flattening of importance distorts perception, making trivial matters feel urgent and serious issues feel interchangeable. Over time, people adapt their behavior to the feed's incentives. They learn what kinds of messages attract attention and which ones disappear. Communication becomes faster, sharper, and more performative. Instead of fostering dialogue, the feed encourages broadcasting, signaling, and reactive judgment. Carr argues that the feed transforms communication from a means of understanding into a mechanism of stimulation. The result is not informed citizens, but agitated audiences, constantly pulled toward the next emotional spike. Part 2. The Tragedy of Communication. Chapter 4. Fast Talking, Fast Thinking. Carr turns from technology to cognition, examining how speed alters the way we think. Drawing on psychology and neuroscience, he explains that human reasoning depends on time. Reflection, empathy, and moral judgment require pauses, moments when impulses are checked and ideas are weighed. Digital communication removes these pauses. Messages demand immediate responses. Silence is interpreted as absence or guilt. In this environment, Intuition dominates reasoning. People react before they reflect. Carr contrasts this with slower forms of communication, such as letters or books, which historically encouraged deliberation. Slowness was not a limitation, but a cognitive advantage. It allowed individuals to consider alternative perspectives and revise their thoughts. Fast communication, by contrast, favors certainty over doubt and emotion over analysis. It amplifies extreme positions while crowding out moderation. Misunderstandings escalate quickly because there is no time for clarification. Carr warns that when society communicates faster than it can think, errors compound. Decisions become impulsive, conflicts intensify, and collective judgment deteriorates. Chapter 5, Antipathies. In this chapter, Carr tackles a paradox of modern communication. We are exposed to more viewpoints than ever before, yet we seem less tolerant of disagreement. Rather than fostering empathy, constant exposure often hardens hostility. Carr explains that digital platforms encourage people to form identity-based groups. Algorithms recommend content that aligns with existing beliefs, reinforcing shared narratives and emotional bonds within groups. Opposing views are not engaged with thoughtfully. They are caricatured and condemned. Repeated exposure to simplified, emotionally charged representations of opponents breeds moral disgust. Disagreement becomes not a difference of opinion, but a sign of moral failure. Over time, people come to define themselves by who they oppose as much as by what they believe. Carr argues that this process is structural, not accidental. Systems optimized for engagement reward conflict because conflict holds attention. Antipathy becomes profitable. The chapter concludes by showing how constant digital exposure transforms disagreement into division. Instead of bridging gaps, communication technologies often deepen them, turning social friction into permanent fracture. Chapter 6, The Democratization Fallacy. Nicholas Carr opens this chapter by challenging one of the most cherished assumptions of the digital age, that giving everyone a voice automatically strengthens democracy. From the earliest days of the internet, social media platforms presented themselves as tools of liberation. They would flatten hierarchies, weaken elites, and allow ordinary people to participate directly in public discourse. More speech, it was assumed, would lead to more truth, fairness, and accountability. Carr argues that this belief rests on a misunderstanding of how societies actually function. Democracy does not depend solely on participation. It depends on shared standards, trusted institutions, and forms of authority that can organize information and make collective judgment possible. When those structures collapse, participation alone becomes noise. In earlier media systems, gatekeepers such as editors, journalists, scholars, and broadcasters filtered information before it reached the public. While imperfect and sometimes biased, these filters provided context, verification, and proportionality. Social media dismantles these filters in the name of openness. Anyone can publish anything instantly, and all messages appear side by side, competing for attention on equal terms. Carr explains that this radical leveling does not empower citizens so much as overwhelm them. When authority disappears, people do not become more discerning. They become more susceptible to manipulation. Falsehood spreads as easily as truth, often more easily, because it can be tailored to provoke emotion. Expertise loses credibility, while confidence and outrage gain influence. Rather than producing a wiser public, the democratization of communication often leads to fragmentation. People retreat into groups that share their assumptions and resent those who claim authority. Democracy, Carr concludes, cannot survive on expression alone. Without structure, openness turns into chaos. Part 3. Everything is mediated. Chapter 7. The Dislocated Eye. In this chapter, Carr turns inward, examining how constant digital mediation reshapes the individual self. Historically, identity developed through direct experience, reflection, and sustained relationships. People formed a sense of who they were through memory, conversation, and introspection. Social media disrupts this process by externalizing identity. The self becomes something that is displayed, measured, and evaluated in real time. Likes, shares, comments, and follower counts act as continuous feedback signals, encouraging people to adjust how they present themselves. Carr argues that this constant performance creates a sense of dislocation. Instead of inhabiting their inner lives, people begin to view themselves from the outside as objects to be optimized for approval. Attention replaces meaning. Visibility replaces understanding. This shift has psychological consequences. When identity depends on public response, anxiety increases and authenticity erodes. Silence feels like erasure. Disagreement feels like rejection. People become hyper-aware of how they are perceived, yet less certain of who they actually are. Carr suggests that the mediated self is inherently unstable. It changes with trends, algorithms, and audience moods. The result is a persistent sense of restlessness, a feeling of being everywhere and nowhere at once. Chapter 8. Machines Who Speak. Carr next examines the growing role of machines in shaping human communication. Algorithms no longer simply transmit messages. They select, prioritize, and even generate them. Recommendation systems decide what people see, whom they encounter, and which ideas gain traction. These systems are optimized for efficiency and engagement, not truth or wisdom. Their logic is statistical rather than moral. They amplify patterns that keep users active, regardless of the social consequences. Carr emphasizes that machine-mediated communication introduces a new kind of power. Decisions about visibility and relevance are made invisibly, according to criteria users neither understand nor control. Human judgment is quietly replaced by automated processes. As artificial systems begin to speak on behalf of humans, suggesting responses, summarizing opinions, and generating content, the boundary between human expression and machine output blurs. Carr warns that this shift risks hollowing out communication itself. When speech is optimized by machines, it loses its connection to lived experience and moral responsibility. Chapter 9. World Without World. In this chapter, Carr explores how digital communication weakens our connection to physical reality. Historically, communication was grounded in shared spaces and embodied presence. Words were spoken by people standing somewhere, subject to social and physical constraints. Online, those constraints disappear. Messages float free of place and consequence. People argue with abstractions rather than neighbors. Distance dulls empathy and emboldens cruelty. Carr argues that when communication loses its grounding in the physical world, it becomes more extreme. Without immediate feedback from faces, voices, and bodies, people underestimate the impact of their words. The world becomes an idea rather than a lived environment. This detachment erodes social trust. Shared reality fragments into competing narratives, each reinforced by its own information streams. Without a common world to return to, disagreement becomes irresolvable. Chapter 10. Dr. Johnson's Rock. In the final chapter of the book, Carr turns to an 18th century philosopher, Samuel Johnson, who famously refuted abstract idealism by kicking a stone and declaring, "I refute it thus." Reality, Johnson insisted, asserts itself regardless of theory. Carr uses this image to argue that digital mediation cannot fully replace the physical world. Human beings need resistance, limits, friction, and consequences to think clearly and live meaningfully. Communication without boundaries becomes detached from truth. Carr does not call for rejecting technology, but for reasserting human limits within it. Slowness, silence, and presence are not failures of communication. They are its foundations. Without them, society risks drifting into a state where messages multiply endlessly while meaning dissolves. The book ends with a quiet warning. Communication is powerful, but is not inherently moral. Only when shaped by restraint and grounded in reality can it serve human flourishing. Superbloom leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. Communication itself is not the enemy. But unchecked, accelerated communication can quietly unravel the bonds that hold society together. When messages multiply faster than reflection, when attention replaces understanding, and when connection becomes performance, we lose something essential: our ability to think clearly, listen deeply, and live together meaningfully. Nicholas Carr doesn't call for abandoning technology, but for reclaiming our agency within it. The challenge of our time is not to speak more, but to speak better, to slow down, to restore boundaries, and to remember that not everything valuable needs to be shared, amplified, or optimized. Without that restraint, the Superbloom will keep spreading, brilliant, intoxicating, and quietly destructive.